The argument started with a single fence post, but by the time the truth came out, an entire neighborhood realized they had built their backyards on land that didn't belong to them, and the quiet man who owned that land had been watching the whole time. Daniel Mercer had lived in his small brick house at the edge of Cedar Ridge for nearly 6 years. His property sat beside a long strip of empty land that ran behind several houses on the block. Most neighbors barely noticed it. To them it was just an unused patch of grass and trees, but Daniel knew exactly what it was his land. When he bought his house years earlier, the purchase had included a long parcel behind several properties. The realtor had mentioned it casually, almost like a bonus. Daniel never made a big deal about it. The land stayed empty, quiet, untouched, until one spring morning, Daniel stepped outside with his coffee and noticed something strange behind the neighboring houses: wooden posts, fresh dirt, and a brand new fence line stretching across the back of 3 yards. At first he thought maybe the city was doing construction, but as he walked closer, he saw neighbors measuring and hammering boards into place, right on top of his property. Daniel stood silently for a moment, then he calmly asked the question that would start everything: "Hey, who approved this fence?" The neighbors looked at him like the answer was obvious. And that answer would soon create a problem no one expected. One of the neighbors, a tall man named Greg, wiped sweat from his forehead and pointed proudly at the new fence line. "The HOA approved it last month," he said confidently. Several other homeowners nodded in agreement. Daniel glanced at the wooden posts again. They ran perfectly straight behind the houses, perfectly straight across his land. Daniel kept his voice calm. "The HOA doesn't control that strip," he explained. Greg chuckled. "Of course it does. It's part of the shared backyard area." Daniel slowly shook his head. "No. It's part of my property." The laughter stopped. One of the women nearby crossed her arms. "That can't be right," she said. Daniel walked back toward his house without arguing. "Give me a minute," he said. A few minutes later he returned holding a thick folder. Inside were the property documents from when he purchased the house. He unfolded a large survey map and placed it on the tailgate of Greg's truck. The neighbors leaned closer. The property lines were clearly marked, and the fence they had just started building ran directly across Daniel's land. Greg frowned. "Well, the HOA told us this area was communal." Daniel folded the map carefully. They were mistaken. But instead of stopping the construction, the neighbors kept building, and Daniel realized they didn't believe him yet. Over the next 2 days, the fence was finished. Tall wooden panels now stretched across the backyards of 3 homes, turning what used to be open land into large private spaces. To the neighbors, it looked perfect. To Daniel, it looked like someone had quietly taken part of his property. He walked the fence line that evening as the sun dropped behind the trees. The boards were solid, professionally installed. Whoever built it had spent thousands of dollars. Daniel could have called a lawyer immediately, but instead, he did something far calmer. He scheduled a land survey. A week later, bright orange flags appeared along the grass behind the houses. Surveyors placed small stakes every few feet. Neighbors watched curiously from their patios. Then one of them noticed something strange. The flags didn't follow the fence. They ran several feet inside the newly built yards, straight through the middle of patios, gardens, and lawn furniture. Daniel stood quietly near the surveyors as they worked. Greg walked over slowly. "What exactly are they marking?" Daniel pointed gently at the line of flags, the real property boundary. Greg stared at the markers stretching through his backyard, and suddenly the beautiful new fence didn't look so perfect anymore. But the biggest problem was still waiting to be discovered. Within hours, the entire block was talking about the survey flags. Bright orange markers ran like a glowing line through the middle of several backyards. Patios, garden beds, and lawn chairs now sat on the wrong side of the boundary. Greg knocked on Daniel's door that evening. "You're saying our fence is on your property?" Daniel nodded calmly. "Yes." Greg rubbed his forehead. "The HOA told us this strip belonged to the neighborhood." Daniel handed him a copy of the official survey report. The measurements were clear. Every inch of the land behind those houses belonged to Daniel's parcel. Greg looked toward the fence stretching behind the yards. "So what happens now?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped onto the porch and looked across the quiet street. Several neighbors stood outside whispering about the situation. Finally, Greg asked the question everyone wanted to know: "Are you going to make us tear it down?" Daniel thought about it for a moment, then he gave an answer no one expected. "No," he said. Greg blinked. "Then what are you going to do?" Daniel looked toward the fenced yards, and the quiet plan forming in his mind would soon make those backyards completely useless. 2 weeks later, trucks arrived early in the morning. Construction vehicles rolled slowly down the street and parked behind the houses. Neighbors stepped outside, confused. Greg walked over to Daniel immediately. "What's going on?" Daniel pointed calmly toward the strip of land behind the fence. I'm starting a project. Workers began unloading equipment and marking sections of the ground. Within hours, long rows of wooden posts were being installed along the exact property line Daniel owned. But these weren't fence posts, they were supports for something much larger. Greg watched as workers stretched heavy metal frames between them. What are you building? He asked, nervously. Daniel checked the construction plans in his hands, a storage structure. By afternoon, tall metal walls began rising behind the new backyard fences, huge steel panels, windowless, blocking sunlight. The structure stretched the entire length of the block. When it was finished, the neighbors stepped into their backyards and stared in disbelief. Where open sky once existed, there was now a massive metal wall just a few feet away. Their fenced yards suddenly felt small, dark, and completely unusable. But Daniel still wasn't finished yet. Over the next several days, the project continued. Workers installed tall roofing panels across the structure. Large metal doors appeared along the outside facing the empty lot. From the street, it looked like a clean modern storage building. From the neighbors' backyards, it looked like a towering wall. Sunlight barely reached their patios anymore. Gardens stopped growing. Outdoor furniture sat in permanent shade. The beautiful fenced yards they had proudly built now felt cramped and useless. Greg walked over to Daniel again one evening. You planned this the whole time? Daniel shook his head. No. Greg gestured toward the giant structure. But you knew we built the fence on your land. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Greg sighed. We should have listened when you showed us the survey. Daniel looked calmly at the metal wall stretching across the block. I tried to explain. Greg stood silently for a moment. Then he asked the question everyone on the street was wondering. Is there any way to fix this? Daniel looked at the fence behind the houses, and for the first time, he smiled slightly. The answer turned out to be simple. A week later, Daniel invited the neighbors to meet in his driveway. Greg and the other homeowners gathered quietly. Daniel placed a set of papers on the table. It's a land lease agreement, he explained. The neighbors exchanged curious looks. If you want to move your fences back to the correct property line, Daniel continued, I'm willing to lease small portions of the land behind your homes. Greg studied the document carefully. The price was reasonable, much cheaper than rebuilding everything. Within a few days, the agreements were signed, the fences were moved, the backyards opened up again, and Daniel's storage building remained on the rest of his land. Peace slowly returned to Cedar Ridge. The neighbors had learned an important lesson about property boundaries and assumptions, and Daniel had handled the situation without anger or arguments. Sometimes the calmest solution makes the strongest point, and that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you loved the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.